But today we're delighted to welcome back a great friend of the New England Council and an incredible advocate, not just for this wonderful state and not just for New England, but for our nation, and that is Senator Angus King. I thank all of you again for joining us this morning, and I'm now pleased to hand it over to Dan Walker to introduce our guest.
Welcome, everyone, to Pretty Flaherty. Thank you for coming. I guess we had a couple stops and starts to this program with the weather, but I think we've wedged in a beautiful day between a couple more storms here. Again, thank you for coming to Pretty Flaherty. We're a full-service law firm serving in northern New England. We're here in Maine, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. We have just want to bring forward some of, or not bring them forward, but just recognize some folks in our firm. We've got Severin Beliveau, Harold Pacius, got Dave Van Slyke back there, our managing partner, and a lot of other folks here. Again, I'm Dan Walker. I'm chair of our government affairs group. We also have some honored guests here. We got Troy Jackson, Senator Troy Jackson, President of the Senate here today, and we've got lots of clients and friends and members of the community here. I also want to thank Jim Brett of the New England Council. Jim's been the president and CEO of the New England Council since 1996. Happens to be the year I graduated from law school, so it's been a while. But the New England Council was established, it's been around for a long time. It was established in 1925, and it's a wonderful organization serving just the four corners of New England. And it's an honor to serve on the board and to be part of, for Pretty Flaherty to be part of it. And it's a great honor today to introduce Senator Angus King. He was the first independent senator in Maine history and was the 72nd governor of the state of Maine. Back a number of years ago, while he was serving as governor, I also served in the State House as counsel to the Speaker of the House at the time, and so we served in that, and we didn't always agree on everything that we brought forward on our policy positions, but we worked closely with his administration, and during those years, the door was always open in that office, and I think we had a lot of excellent outcomes at that time. As Maine's first independent governor or independent senator, Senator King has been trying to break this partisan impasse that's been going on in D.C., and he's been recognized nationally for these efforts. And I think it's been a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for the state of Maine and for Senator King to try to bring the parties together. Senator King sits on 4 oversight committees: the Veterans Affairs Committee, the Select Committee on Intelligence, the Armed Services Committee, which is crucially important to Maine, as we've got 2 large shipyards up here with BIW and Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. And he also serves on the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources, and he's the chair of the Subcommittee on National Parks. As senator, has had a number of accomplishments, and most recently, along with the rest of the congressional delegation and Governor Mills, helped put a 6-year delay on the proposed lobster regulations in order to further study the issues in the Gulf of Maine. This would have been disastrous for our economy, and we're looking to continue work in that area at this point. He's worked tirelessly to revitalize the Maine forest economy, and he's always advocated for clean, renewable, domestic, cheaper energy that mitigates climate change. He's been has early recognized the advantages of technology, as Maine was one of the first adopters of the laptop program, and continues to do this as he pushes broadband into rural areas. And especially as part of the Intelligence Committee, he strengthened our national security, traveled throughout the world, and has provided this critical oversight that's necessary in this day and age. He's been amazing for higher ed. There's been significant legislative victories for students in higher ed, saving students about $50 billion in interest payments. And most recently, along with Senator Susan Collins, Senator Shaheen, they introduced the Northern Border Regional Commission, NBRC, Reauthorization Act of 2023, which will support job creation and community development in rural Maine in the most economically disadvantaged areas of the state. So, on that note, I would like to introduce Senator King.
Troy, thanks for coming down. It's great to have the President of the Senate here. This is called Portland. That's the Atlantic Ocean out there.
It's like alligators.
They have lobsters in the Aroostook River, but they're a little smaller. I'm delighted to be with you. I can announce safely this morning, I just checked, there are no classified documents at my house. I want to get that out of the way. I want to talk about the Senate, and at the end I'm going to take questions, talk about whatever's on your mind, Twitter. Glad to talk about that. Okay, this is 10 things you might not know about the Senate. Okay, the first is we don't hate each other. There's partisan differences, but not personal. And I think people need to realize that there's this image that we're all at each other's throat and we don't like each other, and that's just absolutely not true. If you watch, what you ought to do is watch a Senate vote on C-SPAN 2. And what you'll see is a lot of milling around while people are coming in to vote. It looks like the dump on Saturday morning. and people are chatting, but it's mostly bipartisan. It's people, I'm talking to Dan Sullivan of Alaska, or Maggie Hassan is talking to Chuck Grassley or something. That's the way it works. Now, one funny thing happened. One day I was chatting with Ted Cruz, who came in with me, and I've always maintained a good relationship with him. So I was chatting with him, and then I walked off the floor, and I guess Mary had been watching the vote, so I immediately got a text that said, "What are you doing talking to Ted Cruz?" I thought, I'm being spied on. I do serve on 2 subcommittees, the National Parks and Energy and Natural Resources. I contend I have the most varied chairs of subcommittees in the Senate. I'm chair of National Parks and Strategic Forces in Armed Services, which is a euphemism for nuclear weapons. Very heavy, serious, but it's a treat, as you can imagine, to be talking about national parks in Acadia and Yellowstone rather than missiles and hypersonics. We don't hate each other. The other thing is a lot more gets done than meets the eye. Troy knows this. The press likes conflict. It's much more interesting to talk about Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell fighting and deadlock and gridlock in Washington and all that kind of thing. We've had, the last 2 years have been the most productive in Congress for maybe the last 20. And there were 7, I was counting up last night, there were 7 major bills passed. 5 of them were entirely bipartisan. 2 of them were the Democrats did it by themselves because they had the votes, but the CHIPS and Science Act, the infrastructure bill, 2 major budgets, the PACT Act for veterans, the defense of the Respect for Marriage Act, all of those were entirely bipartisan, and you don't hear that much, and I think people should know that, and that we can work on these things together, and in fact often do. So that's number one. And it's also something you didn't know is we can get things done. Things are actually happening. The infrastructure bill is the biggest infrastructure bill in 50 years. The PACT Act for veterans and burn pit exposure has been pending for 15 years. So I just think it's important for people to know that it's not all bad news and it's not all fighting with one another. By the way, Severin was a Capitol policeman. Isn't that right?
Yes. United States Capitol policeman, yes.
United States Capitol policeman. And it was he was there roughly the same time that Harry Reid was there, the former Democratic leader. Harry told me that in those days, in order to pass the shooting test, you shot until you hit the target, and then you passed. So I don't know.
The 6th shot, I hit the silhouette in the knee, and I qualified.
That was it. Okay. Number 2, one of the problems with the modern Senate is the schedule. As some of you know, I worked in the Senate 40 plus years ago for Bill Hathaway in the 70s, and in those days, the Senate worked a 5-day week. And then every 4 weeks or so, people would go back to their home state. Today, here's the schedule. Here I am on Monday morning in Maine, right? I'll get on the plane around 12:30 or 1, And the first vote where I have to be there is this afternoon at 5:30, Monday, around 5:30. The last vote, when I have to be there, is Thursday around 1. Well, what happens? Everybody goes to the airport Thursday afternoon, flies home Thursday night, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning. So the point I'm making is we don't know each other. We literally don't know each other. We don't have relationships, and if you don't have relationships, it's hard to deal with difficult issues because you don't have trust. And I've actually been in a group and seen it break down on the lack of trust. You know, we're close to a deal and somebody says, well, this is what McConnell wants, so I'm not, you know, it falls apart. And that's a real problem. Just about all the senators go home every weekend. Brian Schatz, a senator from Hawaii, goes home every weekend. Wow. Senators from Alaska, from state of Washington, Maine. It's easy for me. You know, it's an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and a half from Washington to here. But what that means is there's no socializing. Back in the 70s, everybody was there. Ed Muskie lived in Chevy Chase with his family. His kids grew up there. Bill Hathaway lived in McLean. That's where his kids went to school. They knew each other. They hung out on weekends. And there was this kind of social interaction that there isn't anymore. So I've never thought of how a mechanical thing like the schedule could affect the outcome. And that's a real problem. Because we're only there, Mary doesn't come to Washington. I'm only there 3 nights a week, and I'm usually working. So she's here. So, and I'm here 4 nights a week. So why should she come to Washington? The point is, families aren't there, kids aren't there, and it really has undermined the ability to get things done. Some of you have probably heard, I realized this phenomenon about a year or so after I started, and so I pick up ribs, beans, and coleslaw. In fact, I'm having one tomorrow night with 5 or 6, always bipartisan senators at our little house, 908 square feet. I say that because a Washington newspaper said it was 9,080 square feet. But we have, you know, just ribs, beans, and coleslaw in this conversation. And at one of our dinners, there were two senators sitting like you guys, and one of them looked up from the conversation at me and said, you know, I've seen this guy around here for 8 years, and this is the first time we've ever talked. Does that not tell you about why it's hard to get things done? So that's one of the problems. The schedule is really not conducive to relationships. Second is we have minority control on top of minority control. The Senate would be unconstitutional if it wasn't in the Constitution. Really, because it's grossly malapportioned. Maine has 2 senators, 1.3 million people. California has 2 senators, 50 million people. I mean, there's no theory of democratic representation that has that make sense, but that's the way it was set up. And by the way, there is an upside. Maine has 2 senators. California has 2 senators. So, but the point is, you've got this institution that is largely maybe an overstatement, is to some extent dominated by rural states because they have lower population, but they still have 2 senators. Then you put on top of that the filibuster, which essentially requires 60 votes to pass major legislation. And if you do the math, it basically means if you add those 2 sort of malapportionment things together, 24 representatives of 24% of the nation can block anything that the 76% of the nation wants. That's hard to, you know, in democratic theory, small d, it's a little hard to justify. On the other hand, changing the filibuster, fixing the filibuster, A, is very difficult, and B, I've really wrestled with this, and I'll tell you why. When I first went down 10 years ago, I was, you know, let's get rid of this, you know, it's not in the Constitution, it's created by accident in the early part of the 19th century. But then I met people like Carl Levin of Michigan, people who had been there for a long time and been in the minority and been in the majority. And the best way I thought to put it is, today's obnoxious obstruction is tomorrow's precious defense. You see what I mean? Here's an example. The Affordable Care Act, which I think is very important, failed by one vote. Joe Biden's agenda, or if you're a Republican, enact the president's agenda, but you're giving up your defense. You're giving up something that might be priceless 4 or 5 years, because things always change, things always come around. So it's a difficult issue. I came down on the side not of eliminating it, but of requiring people to actually filibuster. The filibuster, you think of, this person standing there and talking endlessly. Nah, you don't have to do that anymore. You just call Mitch McConnell and say, I'm going to object. 60 votes. You don't have to show up. You don't have to make a speech. You don't have to hold the floor. You don't have to be tired. It's a dial-in filibuster, which I think is inconsistent with the history. If you're going to block up this democratic process, then there ought to be some work involved. So basically what we said was, you have to hold the floor. And if you don't hold the floor at the end of when everybody's exhausted, then you go ahead and have a vote and majority rules, which is what we all learned in kindergarten. And particularly on issues of democracy itself, voting rights, those kinds of things. I think it's hard to justify blocking entirely the ability to protect people's rights to participate in our system. So the filibuster is hard. If you asked me today to say, you want to abolish the filibuster, I think I'd say no, because of it forces us to get bipartisan support, and two, if it's gone forever. It's never going to come back, and you're never going to have and Carl Levin taught me, as wonderful senator from Michigan, that times always change, and you better be careful if you're eliminating something that you may find very important later on. Number 5, it really matters who's president. And what I mean by that, it's obvious it matters, but I'm talking about in ways you don't think about. Who's on the FCC? Who's the commissioner and who's the Secretary of Agriculture? How are the regulations in NOAA going to be administered? In other words, what I learned is that the president has enormous influence in ways that aren't obvious. State of the Union and vetoes and all that. But there's enormous that has a lot to do with how things function and how the system works. So my note says, really matters who's president. Number 6, staff matters a lot. You're looking at a corporate person who is really representing or working with about 40 people, about 25 in Washington and 15 in Maine, who vastly enable me. I couldn't do what I have to do. And it ranges from people up here. I have a person up here, for example, who's become a specialist in obtaining medals for veterans who didn't get them, who earned them, but for some reason it got lost in the bureaucracy of the Pentagon. I pinned a medal on a guy who earned, I think it was a Silver Star or something, for action in the Pacific in World War II. It was a very moving experience, as you can imagine. So the staff is what really enables us all. Troy is nodding. Yeah, seriously, that help you. The senator comes back and says, let's do something about jaywalking. I don't know. And the staff has to then do the research and make that all happen. And I have absolutely wonderful people. By the way, I will share with you the secret of leadership. Ready for this? You might want to write this down. Hire good people and take credit for what they do. It's worked for me for 30 years. Okay. Number 7. Power in the U.S. Senate has migrated to the leaders. I think going back to Lyndon Johnson. When I worked there in the 70s, the power was in the committees. the committee chairs, you remember this, Severin, were referred to the barons. The barons of Capitol Hill. Well, now the power is in Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. And they have enormous power. For example, the majority leader has absolute discretion over what comes to the floor. The majority leader can decide this bill that's been reported out by a committee unanimously ain't coming to the floor for whatever reason. Or the majority leader can write a bill, have a bill written in their office, and bring it to the floor that's never been before a committee, that nobody has ever seen before. So that's enormous power. Now, if I had been talking to you about this 2 or 3 years ago, I would have ended there. But an interesting thing has happened in the last 2 years. Remember those bipartisan bills I mentioned, the infrastructure bill, the PACT Act, all those? They came organically out of the Senate, and the leaders then blessed them. The infrastructure bill didn't come from Chuck Schumer's office or Mitch McConnell's office. It came from a group of senators, 10 or 15, who got together and said, we got to do something about infrastructure, and started to negotiate. Republicans and Democrats came up with a bill, and then Chuck and Mitch said, yeah, this is okay. And we got 65, 70 votes. I remember we were talking earlier, when the infrastructure bill was going on, I have a good friend, I won't mention his name, Dan, no, I won't mention his name. Anyway, the vote was, we were having the vote on the floor, and I texted him and said, no going to ribbon cuttings unless you vote for the bill. I think he voted for the bill. But it's, what I'm saying is that the leader's power is still there, it's still enormous, but there is an ability to get things done sort of organically from within a group if you have a bipartisan group in the Senate. Number 8, and this is kind of obvious, the Senate is divided because the country's divided. The country's divided, and that's just a fact. And it shouldn't be surprising that our representative government is representing the country, which is divided politically, and it's a difficult. What bothers me about today's politics? There's several, but one is you can't just disagree. The other person is evil. That's not right. I mean, my experience has been good ideas come from everywhere, and everybody has. One of my favorite comments came from John Martin, of all people. John Martin once said to me when I was up in Augusta, you can't hate somebody if you know the names of their kids. I thought that was a pretty profound observation. And somehow we've gotten into this politics where not only I disagree with you, you're wrong and you're bad. And that just isn't consistent with the way life is. But that's sort of the reality of where we are in the country. In fact, I heard the other day, when I was a kid, the big issue in a family was if your son or daughter was going to marry a Catholic, or if you were a Catholic family and your son or daughter was going to marry a Presbyterian. Big deal. People talk about disinheritance, and all that kind of thing. Now, there's actual polling that people care more about the political party of the person their child is marrying. You're going to marry a Republican or a Democrat. That's not. It shouldn't be that way. I mean, it shouldn't be that way. I don't believe. Number 9. We're almost there. Earmarks work. Earmarks work. I remember talking to Mitch McConnell on the floor one day, and he said, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, before we started doing them again, that getting rid of earmarks was the biggest mistake we made. And there's no coincidence that we've gotten full-blown budgets the last couple of years. Why? Because every member has something in it. All it takes is $200,000 for an airport in your district, and then it's your budget. You see, you have a stake in it. And before that, it was nobody had any direct. I mean, hit the large, the national defense and domestic issues, but this individual stake. Plus, I humbly think that Susan and I and Jared and Shelley know better what's needed in Maine than somebody at the Department of Transportation in Washington. And so it's a limited amount, and it's got to be wholly transparent. You can go on the list and see what I supported and where it all went. But it really has, I think, made a difference. And what I think is terrific, as I've traveled the state to visit some of these sites, this money, which is now, by the way, you can't say earmark anymore. It's congressionally directed spending. But anyway, it's a source of funding for a lot of projects that have no other place to go. The roof of the Harrison Food Bank, the mortgage on a peer-to-peer recovery center in Medway, a sidewalk project in Holton. These are, and there are dozens of others. This is difference making in these little communities, and it's a source that you would not otherwise get. Another story about Mitch: there are now 14 former governors in the Senate, both parties. Romney, King, Hassan, Shaheen, Warner, Kane, whole lot of them. A fellow named Ricketts, I think, from Nebraska. Anyway, there are 14 of us. We have a little club, a little former governor's caucus. So I went up to Mitch McConnell 3 or 4 years ago when we were getting this going, and I said, Mitch, I just want you to know we're forming a former governor's caucus. He said, well, Angus, I'll tell you, I've noticed if you have a former governor who's now a senator, and you ask them which job they like better, if they say senator, you know they'll lie to you about other things. It's the only time I ever heard Mitch McConnell tell a joke. That's an absolutely true story. And then number 10, it's a fascinating and occasionally, more than occasionally, rewarding. Being able to see something that you accomplish on behalf of the people of your state or of the country is, there's nothing more. It's why we do this, and it is fascinating because it's always something. I mean, you ought to see my schedule. I went over the schedule this morning. It's everything. It's 10 different things a day, 10 different meetings on entirely different subjects, and it's fascinating. And for a person who's sort of innately curious, it's the ideal job. I came home early on and said to Mary, I've been preparing for this job all my life, I just didn't know it. Because it has such a great variety of challenges, and also, and this is a part of having been there now a while, I feel like I can get stuff done. I'm getting in, I'm learning this business of the organicness, of infrastructure bill and those kinds of things. I was part of that, and I feel like I've really been able to accomplish something. You don't have to be there, 40 years and be the chair of the committee and that kind of thing. A lot of the things, broadband is a good example of something that my first issue when I got there was broadband. That was 10 years ago. And my staff guys, a guy named Adam Lockman from the Mid-Coast, and he became the de facto staff to the broadband coalition, or the broadband caucus that put that infrastructure bill together that's going to wire every house in Maine. Wow, that's amazing. I mean, that's going to change the state. So anyway, that's my list for today, and I'll be glad to take questions. I'll talk about the Twitter thing just to context. The year is 2018, and I'm on the Intelligence Committee, which I've been on forever, and in the midst of the Russia investigation. And I was a public member of it, and I learned, working with Richard Burr and the chair of the committee and others, that the Russians were actively getting engaged in our politics. By the way, I have to tell you one great story about Richard Burr. Part of my job on the Intelligence Committee during that investigation was to try to keep them together. I was the catcher in the rye, trying to keep it bipartisan, which it was. And so one day, Mark Warner, the Democratic vice chair, it's interesting, Intelligence Committee, it's the vice chair, not the ranking member, the vice chair. So it has a nonpartisan feel. Richard was the chair. I saw Richard after Mark had done a press conference, and I said, Richard, that was a great press conference. It was bipartisan. You guys were together, and reassuring to the country. really did a great job. And I said, like they say in Hamilton, history has its eyes on you. And Richard took a step back and said, I don't know if you want to quote Hamilton to me, Angus, since my great-great-great-grandfather shot him. And it turns out he is a descendant of Aaron Burr. Anyway, okay. So I'm involved in this investigation and I'm aware of what the Russians did in 2016 and what they were capable of. So I hired a person in my campaign to protect me from bots and disinformation and that kind of thing. It was one of the first campaigns in the country to do that. And what they did was discovered some suspicious accounts and send them to Twitter. They didn't say take them down. They said, look at these. We're suspicious, but you have more technology and data than we do. See if they're consistent with your standards, which Twitter has and Facebook has. And you know, we essentially said, here's what we see. Or not, it wasn't me. It was my digital defense person. Said these things look suspicious. Take a look at them. So that's essentially what happened. And but now I'm caught I'm sort of collateral damage in the middle of this. There's a conservative belief, and there are people in this room, I suspect, that Twitter and Facebook and the big tech companies were favoring liberals and were suppressing conservative voices. That's the issue. And so that's what they're trying to pin on me. It isn't true. What we were more worried about was where the stuff was coming from, rather than the content. It wasn't like we were saying if somebody's critical, we're going to try to get rid of you. That wasn't the issue. The issue was the source, and so it'll keep going, I suspect. But that's the story. In fact, one of the emails that sent this famous list of accounts said, we don't want to impinge on anybody's free speech rights, but we want you to use your technology to see if it violates your standards. That's basically, we handed it off to them. So that's the story. But it's pretty juicy, so it's going to keep. I think it's going to keep going. I don't do Twitter myself. Oh, and my office, I checked with my office. I said, since being a senator, this was in a campaign. Since being a senator, have I been in touch with any of these guys? I'm told that the only time the office reached out was when there were people impersonating me. There were people created Instagram accounts. Senator Angus King wasn't me, and we said, you know, I hope it's okay to defend yourself against that. I guess my conclusion would be everybody has the right to free speech except bots. You know, so I wanted to answer that one because I suspect it's on some of your minds. Other questions? Sir.
Senator,
Jim Roach.
Jim Roach with the Maine Bankers. Given your comments about how you and your
I'm meeting with the credit unions tomorrow. I got a full disclosure.
No comment. So given your comments about how senators, are friendly toward one another, but lack the camaraderie and interaction of 40, 50 years ago, and you noted that much of it, or some of it, is as a result of the Senate schedule. Is Mitch McConnell and Schumer, are they looking at changing the schedule to try to address that?
No, I don't think
Are there
so.
any talks like that?
I don't think so. No, and through some oversight, I'm not in line to be the majority. No, I don't think so. And in fact, I think the parties, to some extent, want to keep us apart. For example, the Democrats have an official lunch on Tuesday and Thursday. Remember, we're only there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The Republicans have an official lunch Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So it really diminishes our ability to have any social interaction outside of official committee. My favorite hour of the week is the Wednesday morning Senate prayer breakfast, which I used to chair. And the reason I like it, number one, it's a quiet hour, in the midst of all this craziness. Secondly, it allows you to learn something about your colleagues. Because the way the prayer breakfast works is there's no staff and no press. It's only senators and former senators. And each week a senator speaks about ostensibly about their faith, but it's always autobiographical. So you learn about who these people are, and you get some sort of personal insight, which is really fascinating. For example, Ted Cruz's father got out of Cuba. He was in a prison to Texas with $100 in his underwear, and that's how his family came to America. I mean, I think that's you learn things like that. Lindsey Graham was raised above a bar and pool room, and his parents died, and he had to raise his sister on Social Security, and just learning those kinds of personal background things. So that's why I like the prayer breakfast.
Mark Gallagher.
Senator King, thank you so much for taking time to be. It's Mark Gallagher, Drummond Woodson.
Sure. They let you in this place?
I'm just surprised
You got a visa or something?
Somehow the vetting process.
Then I'd like them out.
I wanted to ask you a question about something that I think is critical to rural Maine. The Maine Indian Settlement Act is now 43 years old. It has not been revised. There's been a Harvard study recently that articulates the inequities that the tribes here in Maine have suffered compared to other tribes in other parts of the country because of its status compared to those other tribes in other states. Representative Gold, in this Harvard study, the personal income of tribal members outside of Maine has increased by 61%. The personal income of tribal members here in Maine has only risen by 9% in that time frame. Jerry Golden had a piece of legislation that tried to kind of attack these inequities. I know that you had some concerns about it, ultimately opposed it. I wanted to ask you, how would you attack these inequities? How do we get to a situation where the tribes in Maine are treated on the same level as the tribes in every other state in the country?
Okay, the first answer is the tribes in Maine are treated essentially the same as other tribes across the country. For example, they're totally, the Settlement Act makes explicit they are entitled to any and all financial support that goes to any other tribe. That's clear. There are a lot of people in Maine that have the impression that somehow, in fact, I got emails saying the tribes aren't getting any federal money because of the Settlement Act. That's not true. I mean, they get money for housing and health care and all the money that the tribes get generally. So that's number one. Number two, all the laws that are passed with regard to other tribes apply in Maine with one exception. And the exception is, and this was the heart of the Settlement Act, was laws that conflict with Maine jurisdiction. For example, environmental laws. And part of the idea was that the Maine tribes' land, which they bought as a result of the Settlement Act, is scattered around. It's not one big reservation, it's scattered. And the state was concerned, and is concerned, that you have a subdivision law that applies in half of a town, but not in the other half that's owned by the tribes. That the jurisdiction of the state was going to be consistent. So that's the difference. Now, what I proposed is, and in fact I've invited the tribes and the governor to meet together, all of us at Indian Island, to talk about what laws have been passed by Congress benefiting tribes generally that our tribes feel that they need. So, and let's talk about those and see if we can fix them. I met with the tribes and their council here in Portland in August of last year, and I said to them, of all the laws passed since the enactment of the settlement involving tribes, which ones are a problem? And I got a letter back, and there were three. The Violence Against Women Act, the Stafford Act, which is the law that controls the disbursement of disaster relief, and the third was a law involving health care that would have allowed the tribes to hire nurses who weren't licensed in Maine. So those were the three. That was, of all the laws, that was what they told me the problem was. So my response was, let's sit down and fix them. In fact, we already fixed the Violence Against Women Act. They're expressly covered under the Violence Against Women Act. And so because here's my concern. We can fix the problems one at a time. If we try this idea of eliminating the exception for state jurisdiction, I don't know where that goes. I mean, it's very hard to determine what what that could do and how that would affect the state. So I'd rather tackle the individual issues, and that's my position. I work closely with the tribes. I'm working with the tribe at Pleasant Point now on an issue of happening in all their pipes froze in their health center, so I'm trying to help them get the funds to fix that. I just think, I guess what I'm saying is, I see a simpler, more direct solution rather than a global solution that could, I believe, create issues for the state that are unnecessary if indeed the tribes have specific issues. So that's and the Harvard study has a lot of problems. I don't want to go into that, but a lot of problems in terms of who they talked to, how they understood it, and they made assertions that the Settlement Act kept the tribes. The biggest one that our tribes missed, and interestingly, they didn't list this when I asked them, is the casino law, the so-called IGRA, Indian Gaming Act. And so they didn't get a casino. And that may explain a lot of that economic difference. But the tribe, on the other hand, our tribes get things that other federal tribes don't get. For example, there's a lot of talk about sovereignty. Aren't you sorry you asked this question? There's a lot of talk about sovereignty. Most of the Western tribes, their governments, their tribal governments are under the supervision of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the Department of Interior. Ours aren't. So ours have none of that oversight by Washington. Secondly, our tribes get state aid. They get education aid for their schools. I don't think any tribes in the country get that. Another opportunity that they have is that they don't do property taxes, so they could use that as an economic development. The study was conclusory, but didn't really say here's why here's where the problem is. And so I'm all for helping the tribes, and I've been working with them since I was governor. But I'm not prepared to erase what was really the heart of the Settlement Act, that state jurisdiction would be maintained consistently throughout the state, and yet, the tribes are entitled to all the other benefits of federal law. So, as you can tell, I've given this some thought. It's not easy to take a position that can be characterized as, I get letters saying, why don't you like the Indians? I get along great with them, at least I did until this. But I just want to do it right. I want to be careful. And my approach is, okay, what's the problem? Let's fix it. Not do a global solution that may end up causing more problems than it solves.
Senator, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Ukraine. U.S. and all our allies are now saying publicly that China may get involved in the Ukraine battle. They're willing to give ammunition, military equipment to Russia to fight in Ukraine. If they do that, is that crossing the red line? And if it is, what's our response, other than maybe tariffs?
Yeah. Well, first, I'll be surprised if they do that. I mean, I think they're under a lot of pressure from Russia, but I don't think they really want to do that. They've told Russia, we'll hold your coat, but you fight. They haven't really made much of an investment. I don't know what the quite right response is, because it's hard to say we can send artillery shells to Ukraine, but China can't sell artillery shells to Russia. I mean, I don't know how we. I mean, I'm very strongly in support of what the Ukrainians are doing. Basically, they're fighting our war. They're fighting a war for us, and all you got to do is look back in history. People call me and say, "Why are we doing this?" I say, "Google Sudetenland, 1938." We're trying to stop an aggressive dictator. One of his people last week said the next stop is Poland. And somebody else, one of his other people, talked about Moldova. And so there's no question in my mind that if he had just swept into Kyiv in a week, which is what everyone thought would happen, they'd now be probing around in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. So I think what we're doing is absolutely the right thing, absolutely the right thing. Putin's best hope, other than getting arms from China, is dividing us. That's his strategy, is to divide the West, divide America, and undermine what we're doing. Finally, I'm taking the position that the president, when he went last week, was in the same compartment in the train that I was in a month earlier. I can't prove it, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Ukrainians are dying, and we're sending arms, but they're dying. It's unbelievable what that country has done and how determined they are. There's 6 million refugees in a country of 40 million people. Internally displaced people, cities, towns and cities absolutely destroyed. And the Russians are, as you all know, bombing civilians. So, Jim, I don't know the answer to your question. I'm hoping that the Chinese are dissuaded from that. If they do go in, then we'll have to see what the response is. China's much more subject to sanctions than the Russians are, because their economy is so much more outward facing. 30% of China's GDP is in exports. And I'll bet you 80% of the exports are to the US and Europe. So there are some tools that could be used. I think China's going to think hard about it.
The Ukrainian government would want the US to give them the F-16s. And the president is holding back, saying, no, we don't want to do that because we're a little nervous about getting even deeper into this the war there. And other people are saying, no, we need them now.
The president is walking a very thin line, and I think he's done it rather well. And the thin line is wholehearted support for Ukraine without starting World War III. And the concern is that jet airplanes, you know, once we give them, they're Ukrainians, and the people flying them are going to be Ukrainians. So I think what they're worried about is a Ukrainian pilot who decides to take matters into his own hands and go to Moscow, or to go, you know, somewhere into Russia, and then suddenly we're in a very dangerous situation. This is an incredibly dangerous situation. The Russians have a huge nuclear arsenal. They have a huge tactical nuclear arsenal. They always talk, you know, saying they're going to use it. They're threatening. I think the president has resisted that, but he can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. And so I distinguish between the tanks, and it's interesting, the HIMARS, the artillery that we're using, they've been very, very effective, but they have a limited range, and they can't go into Russia. And that's been the president's trying to walk that line. And the question, in my view, and I met with all their general staff about 5 weeks ago in Kyiv, they need, they're in a trench warfare. They're in World War I in eastern Ukraine. They need tanks. They need artillery. They need ammunition. That's really, I'm not sure, and most of the damage being done by the Russians isn't from airplanes. It's from missiles. Missiles that are being fired from Russia. And so an F-16 isn't necessarily going to be an effective defense. What they really need is air defense. They need air defense to defend their civilian infrastructure. They're bombing transformers. If you have any spare transformers, let me know. But then there are two wars going on: the civilian infrastructure and the trench warfare in Donetsk and Luhansk. And I'm not sure the planes would add that much. But this is one of those cases where I'm glad I'm not president. This is a very hard decision, because we all say, well, let's give them the planes, and then one of those planes goes awry, and nuclear weapons are used, and who knows where that goes, and then people will say, well, Biden was trigger happy. You know, this is not an easy decision.
Harold?
Oh, a question to that. You're on the Senate Intelligence Committee, and so I think you know the answer to this question, but I'm not sure you can tell us.
I can tell you, but then I'd have to kill you.
But on the subject of aerosols, now it's missiles, what's to stop the Russians? They have a big air force. Using that to just demolish all these cities
Well-
in Ukraine. That's next. I mean, this guy is gonna do whatever's necessary.
Well, Harold, that's the right question, because Putin's history is of overwhelming bombing of civilian infrastructure and cities. He did it in Grozny in Chechnya, and he did it in Syria, in Aleppo. And to me, that's going to be the dilemma. If that starts, and now it's sort of selective. And by the way, the Ukrainians are getting really good at knocking these things down. The Russians will send 100 missiles, and the Ukrainians are knocking down 85 of them. But if that starts with the air, and if they start to fly bombers and things, then that's a whole different ballgame. And that's going to be, I think that's the dilemma for us. And here's the problem. The better the Ukrainians do, the more dangerous Putin becomes. That's the problem. And he's in a box. He made a horrendous series of mistakes. And as being on the Intelligence Committee, my question is, did he have the intelligence and ignore it? Or did he have bad intelligence? And I don't know the answer to that, but now he's caught. And the question is, what's his way out? And that's a very difficult issue. We have a briefing at the Intelligence Committee meeting tomorrow morning on Ukraine and the status. I can tell you one thing. Our military has done an astounding logistical job of handling all of these materials and weapons that are going in mostly through Poland and Germany. The other thing is, and this is a very fair question, Ukraine has a history of corruption. How much of this is being stolen? How much of these weapons are being misused and that kind of thing? I don't know about you, but I bet you've been in a meeting where you're sitting across from somebody and you say, I don't know whether to ask this question because they're going to be insulted. You know, I'm going to screw up the mood of this cordial meeting. That happened to me with Zelensky. I was sitting across from him about as far as from you and I, and I had my question, and I unconsciously thought, do I ask this and sort of undermine this sense of good friendship? And I said, shit, this is my chance. I got to. So I said, Mr. President, I have to tell you that if there's a scandal involving misuse of these weapons or misappropriation of the funds, it's going to be very hard for those of us who are supportive of you to continue to do so. And he immediately said, I know. And in fact, about a week later, they fired a whole bunch of people. Not as a result of my question, but he was well aware of the issue. And then later that afternoon, I was with Jack Reed, the chair of the Armed Services Committee, just the two of us. We met with a group, I don't know whether it was in their Justice Department or who it was, but they spent about an hour explaining to us how they were preventing corruption and working with Deloitte, the international accounting firm, and SAP, the software, and they showed us spreadsheets where they kept track of every spare part. So I came away, and you know, you can't guarantee when you're talking billions of dollars, nobody can say none of it is going awry, but I came away impressed that they understood the issue and were paying attention to it. And that was one of the reasons I went on the trip, to try to assure myself that this was being attended to. As I say, I can't guarantee, but I was impressed.
I mean,
We have time for just two quick questions, because the Senator has to leave.
I've got a compliment, not a question. First off, on the way down here, I thought I was following a spy balloon, but turned out to be bird poop on my
Oh,
But no, as far as the compliment, I visited your Augusta office last week representing AARP, and I have to tell you, Teague and Scott made it so accommodating, made us feel so welcome, took the time to discuss anything we wanted to, and kudos to you for picking them.
So you know what I'm talking about when I say it's all about having really good staff. Because I couldn't be there that day, but those people, yeah, Teague Morris
We
works
planned
almost
it that way.
Yeah, Teague Morris works entirely pretty much with seniors and veterans. Does a great job.
One more softball question.
Hi, my name is Jill Carney. I'm the Director of Public Policy at the Alzheimer's Association. We're going to be in DC in 3 weeks, so we hope to see you there with our advocates.
I'm sure you will.
I do want to ask about access to FDA-approved treatments for Alzheimer's. There are new and better treatments that are coming online. We're entering a brand new era. And just moving forward, how are you thinking about how the government, both the administration and Congress, can help promote equitable access to these treatments?
Well, of course, the issue is cost. And then you get to Medicare, and Medicare is not in the greatest financial shape. And so I think that's going to be a judgment that has to be made by the FDA on efficacy. And then Medicare is going to have to make a judgment about efficacy and cost and how that will affect the overall system. But clearly, Alzheimer's, all of us know people that have been affected by it. It's just a horrible disease. And I'm frankly interested in prevention. And I don't think we spend enough money studying and doing research on prevention, both in things like Alzheimer's and cancer, but also mental health issues. The National Institute of Health spends about $30 billion a year on research in Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease. The National Institute of Mental Health spends about $1.5 billion. I think that's not the right proportion, because we're dealing with an epidemic of mental issues in this state and in this country: depression, suicide, drug abuse, and so that's an area that I'm trying to make a difference in, is to get, and again, it's research. It's getting either the cures or the prevention. That's the reason I was so much in favor of the Affordable Care Act. When I worked in Washington, in the Senate 40 years ago, I had an insurance plan that gave me a free physical, and they gave the physicals on Wednesday nights. So I didn't have to take a day off work, and it didn't cost me anything, so I got a physical. First one I'd had in like 9 years. Doctor said, "There's a mole on your back, I don't like the looks of it, have your wife watch it." The next day he said, "I don't like that thing, get it taken off." The long story is it turned out to be melanoma. And many of you know that have anything to do with this disease. Melanoma is eminently treatable. If it's caught in time, if it's not, you're gone. And I was saved by that free physical. And I've always been haunted by the fact that there was some young man in America that year who didn't have insurance, didn't have a physical, didn't catch the mole in time, and is gone. And that's why I'm so passionate about prevention and insurance and having people have the opportunity, because that's how you catch these things. And so many diseases, particularly cancer, can be dealt with if it's caught early enough. But if it isn't, there's no chance. So that's one that I'm pretty strong on. Anyway, thanks, Jim.
Okay, great.
Can we finish on a lighter note?
Debt ceiling? How about ESG?
The debt ceiling. It's really funny how in Washington everybody cares about the debt except when they don't. And it flips back and forth, you know. The Republicans didn't care about it when they passed the big tax cut that was unfunded. The Democrats aren't too worried about it when they're passing the infrastructure bill, although the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed was fully funded, which was a good thing. Debt ceiling is, we shouldn't have it. I mean, if Congress votes to appropriate the money, that should be it. The debt ceiling is as you probably know, most of you probably know, the debt ceiling allows us to pay the bills we've already incurred. It doesn't increase space to borrow more money. It simply says you can pay the bills that have been. It would be like using your credit card, buying dinner and a ball game, and then at the end of the month saying, "Well, I'm not going to pay." And that's exactly what the debt ceiling is all about. It's an anachronism. It was enacted during World War I, and now all it is a weapon. And it's going to be. I don't know how it's going to come out. I don't know the price is going to be. I'm hoping, because it not doing it is catastrophic. And there may be enough Republicans in the House to say, we're not going to put the country through this. It would only take 5 or 6 brave people. But I'm sure there'll be a negotiation, and the question is, what will the price be? But
Make it administrative and executive and not congressional.
yeah, well, Mitch McConnell actually had a plan 5 or 8, 10 years ago that said the president could move it, and Congress by 2/3 could override the president's actions. That was, I thought that was a pretty good idea. But it's going to dominate this year. I mean, I haven't talked much about what this year looks like. It's very hard to tell right now whether we'll just be deadlocked and nothing happens, or whether there'll be opportunities for bipartisan action. I still think there are things we're going to be able to do.
The landlord has instructed me that he has another function here very shortly. He's not asking you to go home, you just can't stay here. Thank you. Thank you very much.